Welcome to my Indigenous Studies 100 final project by Melissa Wenstob. I picked to research Indigenous culture in Australia. Australia has two Indigenous people, being the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander people. The Torres Strait Islander people come from the Torres Strait Islands, which are between Cape York in Queensland and Papua New Guinea. These people have their own distinct identity, history, and cultural traditions. Many Torres Strait Islander people live on the mainland of Australia. Aboriginal people come from all over different, diverse nations across Australia, each with their own language and traditions. Historically, these Aboriginal people lived on the mainland of Australia, Tasmania, or on the offshore islands of Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders can also be seen as Aborigines. They are also known as Koori in New South Wales and Murri in Queensland. Aboriginal people have faced a lot of racism and government encroachment in their territory growing up. Many of the people were not given citizenship nor federal suffrage in Australia until the mid-20th century. The Torres Strait people and Aboriginal Australians were the first inhabitants of Australia. A lot of the time the term Indigenous Australian is used for the two groups of people, but it has been found that many dislike the general term Indigenous, being that it is too basic and generic. We also refer to the term saltwater people, which means those who live on the coast or freshwater, rainforest, desert, or spineflex. Indigenous Australians are descendants from the people who lived in Australia and the surrounding islands prior to the European colonization. Between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, there are different languages, cultures, and beliefs between the people. So when we refer to the term Indigenous Australians, we're actually using a collective name to refer to the hundreds of diverse groups. Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander people discovered a couple distinct tools, one being the boomerang that is seen in the top picture that was used for hunting, and the didgeridoo seen in the bottom picture that was a musical instrument. The didgeridoo is actually still popular today. Every year on the same day, Australia apologizes to the Aboriginal people for the wrongdoings in the past. This is seen as National Sorry Day. The country of Australia is honored and pays tribute to the stolen generation of the mistreatment of Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander people. Australia has marked and made the day, May 26th, every year, National Sorry Day. National Sorry Day began as the National Day of Mourning in 1998 for the stolen generation, where children of Indigenous people were forced to be separated from their families by federal, state, and church authorities between 1905 and 1967. The date was chosen in remembrance to the Bringing Them Home report. In the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission records Australian history where it reveals and describes the details of the lives that were taken from their mothers and forced to be raised in orphanages and foster homes by white people, with the attempt to better assimilate them within the Australian society. Many children were raped, beaten, and abused by who was supposed to be their protectors. This tended to happen more often in remote areas, such as areas in the Northern Territory. The day, May 26, also stands for apologizing to the outback Indigenous people for the brutal treatment they received by colonial forces back in the 19th century. Many people were hunted and slaughtered, and because of that, the Healing Foundation, set up by the human rights organization Reconciliation Australia, has been working with members of the stolen generation on having them accept their past treatment and reconnecting to reconsolidate with lost relatives. Originally, Aboriginal Australian people come from Asia via Southeast Asia and have been in the continent of Australia for at least 45,000 to 50,000 years. Indigenous or Aboriginal people are so called. This is because they are living on their land being settlers before settlers come from other parts of the world. The Indigenous and Aboriginal people were the descendants and those who inhabited the country or geographical region. Aboriginals were seen to have left Africa up to 75,000 years ago, being one of the oldest continuous population outside of Africa, and have seen to have thrived in Australia, usually in nomadic societies. I found 5 facts on Australia's history. One being the oldest living culture in the world. Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders go back at least 50,000 to 75,000 years ago. 2. There are more than 250 Australian Indigenous languages that exist. Today, less than 20 languages are spoken. In recent times, it was said that 100 out of 250 languages became unspoken, and the reset of languages were highly endangered. Number 3, Australian English borrows more than 400 words from the Aboriginal languages. Most borrowed words were nouns, some being koala, wombat, barramundi, kookaburra, boomerang, yakka, and bung. Bung being an adjective for bad or deceased. The word kangaroo is an Aboriginal word originated from Captain James Cook's visit to Australia, when he had stopped to do repairs on his ship that is a place now known as Cooktown. Number 4, avoidance practices. Many cultural protocol when it comes to death is that members of some cultures refrain from mentioning the name of or viewing images of deceased people as a sign of respect to the person or family. Avoidance period may last anywhere from 12 months to several years, and the length of time is determined by the community. And number 5, Dreamtime. Dreamtime is an Aboriginal cultural and spiritual identity, Indigenous understanding of the world's creation, and is a continuous story that never ends. Aboriginal Australians have a complex and diverse culture. Indigenous communities in Australia keep their cultural heritage alive by passing knowledge, arts, ceremonies, and performances from generation to generation, as well as speaking and teaching languages, cultural materials, significant sites, and objects. As of 2001, the Aboriginal population in Australia has grown to more than 400,000 people. It was originally expected to rise to 470,000 by 2006, but is still only 2% of the population in Australia itself. Times are changing and improving in the world today, but they are still improving for those people in Australia with glaring inequalities between different races. Today, Aborigines who live in a bigger, larger, more major cities of Australia deal with alcoholism and violence. That is just their way of life and how they live. Aborigines in Australia are also very poor and unfortunately have very low standards of living. Aboriginal elders are trying to pass down their way of living and their knowledge to young men, teaching them and trying to change violent tendencies by taking them to more sacred cities and trying to teach them the ancient ways of their people. The education system in Australia is also very sad for those young Aboriginal children. The educational system was once segregated, but today is not open to Aboriginal children to attend. Many are encouraged to attend, however, many drop out at a very young age. Aborigines who have chosen to continue to live in more so rural areas of Australia or the outback have tried to keep their traditions and what they have learned in the past and history alive. Other Australian people have tried to attempt to build shelters and houses for these Aboriginal people, but have not been a success, and Aborigines choose to use those structures for storage only. Many traditions that the Aborigines have are trying to be passed down and make awareness of their history to other Aborigines who have maybe lost their knowledge. Teachers have been hired to train students in traditional Aboriginal languages. Even a few radio stations and TV stations feature Aboriginal programming only to educate the people and generations to come that may have no prior knowledge or experience with their culture. Here are a few different pictures I have found on the rural land of Australia that these Aboriginal people have lived in. I have found that Aboriginal art is the oldest continuous living culture in the world's history and is very important to the Aboriginal people of Australia. Aboriginal culture is found on the rock art, which has thus far been dated back to at least 20,000 years ago, which archaeology has been dated back to 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. Aboriginal art has been considered to start at the desert community of Papaya, which is in the Northern Territory of Australia, back in 1971. Aboriginal art is based on storytelling, using symbols as a method of writing stories of cultural importance, as well as passing along their knowledge of things that are of importance to them, such as survival and land management. Aboriginal art is geographical in character and style, being that different areas and different traditional languages used approach the art in specific ways. As I mentioned before, Dreamtime is a very commonly used term for the Aboriginal people for describing important features of the Aboriginal spiritual beliefs and existence, generally not well understood by non-Indigenous people. Aborigines believe that the land and people were created by spirits. They made the rivers, streams, waterholes, land, hills, rocks, plants, and animals. Believe that the spirits had gave them their hunting tools and the land to each tribe, their totems, and their daydreaming. Aborigines believe that the entire world that surrounds them was made by past ancestors in the beginning of time. That is where the name daydream has come from. Believe that the ancestors made everything: the people, the rocks, the mountains, rivers, creeks, waterholes, plants, and even animals. The ancestors of these Aborigines made specific sites to show the Aboriginal people where and which places were seen to be sacred. The Aboriginals then performed ceremonies and customary songs by these sites. To please and in respect to the ancestral spirits were also seen as to keep these spirits alive. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.